Good morning. I didn't realize that we were live. Okay, starting now. Um, so this morning's Parsha, which I invite you all to follow along with me, is from we're still in the book of Genesis, and will be for a few more weeks. And we are in a parsha that has a lot of drama by Yeshev. It starts on chapter 37 of Genesis. And before we begin with the actual study of the Torah, I would like to make you aware of something that I read this morning. I actually think I had read it before, but I read it this morning in the New York Times, and I helpfully brought the clip. It's about Sam Bankman-Fried, the now disgraced and indicted financier who lost $26 billion overnight, which is actually probably the $26 billion was not real, but nonetheless, even to lose a fake $26 billion or part of it is impressive. But this is what he said. "I would never read a book," Bankman-Fried said earlier this year. "I'm very skeptical of books. I don't want to say no book is ever worth reading, but I actually do believe something pretty close to that." As far as I'm concerned, that's the diagnosis of his problem, at least in part. And should he have time, assuming he goes to prison, to read, may I suggest a book that might be helpful, which is the Torah. And one of the reasons that the Torah is helpful is because it has deep ethical questions, issues, and struggles for resolution. And certainly Vayeshev introduces two of them. One, which we're going to talk about in much greater detail over the course of the next couple of weeks, is the Joseph story. But the other, which is related to the Joseph story, is the story of Judah and Tamar. And I want to look at that story a little bit this morning with all of you. It's chapter 38 of the book of Genesis. And Judah, remember, is Joseph's older brother. And this story about Judah, which only takes up one chapter, is inserted without any explanation, except it says around that time this happened, but without any explanation really about its connection to the Joseph story. It's just kind of dropped in as a separate event. So in chapter 38, it says, "About that time Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adullamite and saw the daughter of a Canaanite, and married her and cohabited her, and she conceived a son and bore him 3 sons." Okay? So let's leave aside why Judah married a Canaanite. The rabbis, of course, assume that she converted, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. The point is he gets 3 kids. Now, he finds a wife for his oldest son, Er. They get married. And then Er dies. So, according to biblical law, if a brother is born without issue, in other words, without children, then the other brother's responsibility is to provide a child with that wife to inherit the brother's estate, the older brother's estate, or the married brother's estate. So, Judah gives her to Onan, the second son. Onan, it seems like even though onanism is traditionally, and in Western literature and civilization, a synonym for masturbation, that doesn't seem like what's going on here. In fact, what seems to be going on is what is called coitus interruptus. It says, Judah said to Onan, "Join with your brother's wife, do your duty." But Onan, knowing the seed wouldn't be his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife. And so that's what we would call withdrawal, or coitus interruptus. It then became onanism and caused endless tsuris for people by saying that masturbation was against the Bible. But if you read the simple terms of it, that's not actually what the biblical story is talking about. Nonetheless, for not providing a child for his older brother, God takes Onan's life too. So Tamar has married two brothers, and both of them have died. Judah, the father, doesn't want her to marry his third son, the only son he has left, and so he sends her away until Shelah, that's the third son, grows up. But in fact, he has no intention whatsoever of marrying her to Shelah, which consigns her to a life of isolation and childlessness and sadness. So what happens next is that Judah's wife dies. That is the father. I hope you're keeping all these people. Remember, Judah has two sons. They've both died. The third son, he doesn't want to marry Tamar because he's afraid she'll die too. He'll die too. Now Judah's wife, the father's wife, has died. So he goes out, and Tamar sees that Shelah is now an adult, but still is not being given to her as her husband. So she disguises herself as a prostitute. Anybody who thinks that the Torah is PG has not read the Torah. This is definitely a book for adults. And in fact, I remember when I was a kid that when we studied the book of Joshua, when I was in yeshiva, they skipped the part about Rahab the harlot. I know because it's the only time I deliberately, willingly went home and read a chapter of the Bible because I was curious why we skipped it. But here, Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute, and she finds Judah and sleeps with him. So she figures if she's not going to have a kid with his sons, she'll have a kid with him, which is a kind of form of incest, although it's incest with a twist. She sleeps with the father of her two dead husbands, okay? And she asks him for payment because she's pretending she's a prostitute. The fact, by the way, that Judah doesn't see who she is, even if she disguised herself, also says something about his character. Here's the woman who married two of his sons, and he doesn't even recognize her. However good her disguise, after all, you would think he would at least suspect it. So he says, I will send you a kid from my flock. That is, the check is in the mail. She says, no, you have to leave me a pledge until you actually send the kid, because I don't entirely trust you, although she doesn't say that. And he says, what should I give you? And she replies, your seal, your cord, and the staff which you carry, which Robert Alter, the professor of Bible and literature at Berkeley, writes basically is the equivalent of all your major credit cards. So he gave them to her, slept with her, and she conceives by him. Then she goes on her way. So notice, by the way, she did the negotiation before they slept together. So he sends the kid to redeem the pledge, but his friend can't find her. So he asks the people from the town, where's that prostitute? They say there's been no prostitute here. And he returns to Judah and he can't find her. And 3 months later, he hears that Tamar is pregnant. Because he's still getting news, obviously, of the woman that he's supposed to betroth his youngest son to. So he says, and this is indicative of his character so far, bring her out. I'm now in verse 24, for those of you who want to follow. Bring her out, said Judah, and let her be burned. This is chapter 38, verse 24. The entire story, by the way, is contained in chapter 38. The whole story, beginning and end, is in one chapter. So Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned. So the same person that is preventing his kid from marrying her sleeps with her unknowingly and then says she deserves death for her adultery, because that's how he sees it, since she's supposed to be betrothed to his youngest son, even though he doesn't intend to ever give his youngest son to her. Judah doesn't come out of this so great so far. As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I'm with child by the man to whom these belong. Examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are they? Judah recognized them. So the Vayaker Yehuda, the word Vayaker, recognize, is a word that recurs again and again in the Joseph story. And it has to, because all of these stories are about not recognizing and recognizing. It goes back to Isaac and Jacob and Esau, right? Isaac doesn't recognize his son. Then he thinks it's his other son, or seems to think it's his other son. Jacob and Esau don't really recognize who the other is until they reconcile. Jacob doesn't recognize that he's sleeping with Leah instead of Rachel. Jacob later recognizes the cloak of his son Joseph and thinks that he was killed. The brothers don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes the brothers. I mean, it's all of it is a thread of unawareness and then revelation. And here is where Judah, in this verse, Judah does tshuva. And this is why he grows to be the person he is, and we'll see later in the Joseph story, Judah is the one who steps forward when Joseph is going to take Benjamin and says, no, don't take him, because it'll kill our father. In other words, Judah has changed. Because what does he say in verse 26? Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I. Tzadka mimeni. She's more just than I am. Now, for him to say that when he believes he's lost two sons to her and he slept with her and she indicts him is pretty remarkable, because in that society you have to believe that he could have denied that they were his. Who knows what he could have done to her. Inasmuch as I did not give her my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again. Now, the remarkable part of the remarkable thing about this is what happens later. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. There are always twins. The Bible's big on twins for many reasons. While she's in labor, one of them put his hand out, and the midwife tied a crimson thread to that hand to signify this one came out first. That's where you get the crimson thread, which so many of you know. But just then, he drew back his hand, and out came the brother, and she said, what a breach you have made. So he was named Peretz. Afterwards, his brother came out, on whose hand was the crimson thread, and he was named Zerah. Now, Peretz, who is the product, again, of a quasi-incest, is the ancestor of King David. So the Messiah, the Messianic line, comes from incest, and then comes also from Ruth, right? So, or adultery. This is sort of adultery and incest. Also comes from adultery through David and Bathsheba, because Solomon, the Davidic line goes through Solomon. Comes through Ruth. It comes through conversion. In other words, the Messiah has, in the Messianic lineage, is every variety of illicit conduct, which is amazing if you think about it. Adultery, incest, outmarriage, even though, as I said, Ruth converts in the Bible, it's still some species of outmarriage because she originally was a Moabite, on and on and on. And in fact, the Moabites, as you may know, it says explicitly in the Torah that someone from Moab shall never enter the congregation of Israel. So the rabbis get around this by saying, well, Ruth wasn't a Moabite, she was a Moabitess, right? She was a female. It doesn't say that about the women, it just says that about the men. So why is this story in the middle of the Joseph story? Without doing the entire Joseph story, because we're going to be doing that in the weeks ahead, Part of it is that Judah doesn't, you don't have to recall, actually, it's in the same Parsha. When Joseph is thrown into the pit, okay, it's, where's the verse? Let's see. Joseph thrown into the pit. When Reuven heard it, he tried to save him from them, right? So Judah doesn't take action. Reuven does. Although Reuven in the end doesn't take action because by the time he gets back to the pit, Joseph is gone. So Judah is one of the brothers who is guilty of collaboration or not objecting. And because Judah is going to be, as you know later, the tribe that survives, right? Almost all of us are descendants of Judah, except those of us that are Kohanim or Leviim. Judah's character really matters. In the blessing at the end of Genesis that Jacob, the dying Jacob, gives to Judah, he says, the scepter will never depart from you. In other words, the messianic line comes through Judah, because it does. Remember, that's Judah's kid who becomes David, who leads to the lineage of David. And so Judah's character really matters. And then later on, you will see that Judah does step up in the Joseph story. And this is the transformative moment. So one reason to tell this story is to give us an insight into the change in Judah that turns him from someone who doesn't object, who is timid, and then who is harsh, into someone who has moral courage. The other reason is that it teaches us the decisive factor of recognition in the Joseph story. That is, here's Judah who doesn't recognize his own kin, and then later on doesn't recognize Joseph, but once Joseph makes himself aware to Judah, just like when Tamar makes himself aware to Judah, he does what he thinks is the right thing. So it does, and there are also verbal affinities. That is, there are specific words in the story that tie together. I'm looking at this because questions. Not to mention. Oh, great question. Okay, so someone asked, I'm sorry I can't see who because Roy is kindly relaying the questions, but I don't know who's asking the question, that it says Tamar is told that Judah is coming. That's why she dresses up as a harlot, because she hears that Judah is coming. Was it a deliberate choice not to say who told Tamar? Here we're talking about verse 13. It says, Judah went up to Timnah with the sheep shearers, and Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah. So it has to be someone who knows who Judah is and tells Tamar. The anonymous tip giver is crucial in the Joseph story too, Ish Dotan, because when Joseph goes out to seek his brothers, it's a man from Dotan who tells him, oh, your brothers are over there, and he goes and finds them, and he gets thrown into the pit. I think that the idea of this is that, at least this is the way it's often interpreted and makes sense to me, is that the Bible, it's a way of the Bible saying even things that seem happenstance are part of God's design. Because had someone not told Tamar that, she wouldn't have dressed up, they wouldn't have had sex, she wouldn't have a kid, there wouldn't be a Messiah. Had someone not told Joseph, they wouldn't have gone down to Egypt because he wouldn't have found his brothers and they wouldn't have been separate from their father and able to throw him into a pit. Sometimes the rabbis interpret Ish Dotan as an angel, but yes, I think again and again it is deliberate. Another very deliberate thing is, I won't have all of the verses here, but here's an example. Okay, let's go to verse 25, chapter 37, verse 25. They have just thrown Joseph into a pit, okay? When they sat down to a meal, looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. Then Judah said to his brothers, this is Judah's one intervention, what do we gain by killing our brother and covering his blood? Let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Okay? His brothers agreed. Now, verse 28. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. Okay? Then, when you get to Joseph arriving in Egypt, and here you will find this on verse 39, it says, when Joseph was taken to Egypt, the courtier of Pharaoh and the chief steward brought him there from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. So who sold him and who bought him? It is not at all clear, if you follow all of this, what the sequence is. And at least according to some commentators, the reason that the sequence is messed up is, oh, by the way, I'm sorry, I skipped one important verse. Look at verse 37, go back to 37:36. It says, the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. And then later it says the Ishmaelites sold him to Potiphar. So the commentary of, in modern, I don't know of any classical commentators that say this, but modern commentators say the idea is if you mess up the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, then it's clear that whoever sold him, whoever bought him, God's design was for Joseph to go down to Egypt. And that would explain the same thing as somebody tells Tamar that your father-in-law is coming. So yes, Jennifer asked, since he marries a Canaanite, would his kids be considered Israelite? Yeah, the rabbis assume that he converts. And also remember that the child goes according to the father until later, right? Tribally, when it was the tribe of Israel, when you conquered another people, the women would be married by the Israelite men and they would be considered Israelites. It wasn't really until the time of Ezra and Nehemiah that changed and it started to go through the mother since you didn't know who the father was. But originally, it's clear, I mean, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Joseph, somebody is an Israelite if they join the Israelite tribe through the male. So if you marry Judah, you're an Israelite. All the 12 tribes, they all married women from wherever and made them Israelites. So that has shifted in Jewish history. Originally men, now women. Yeah. So the question was, right, they must have been some distance away in order for Ishmaelites or Midianites to come by the pit and see Joseph and pick him out. Well, and how did the brothers know, first of all, how did the Ishmaelites and or Midianites know that he was there? Was Joseph screaming, which is conceivable, but doesn't really fit with our image of Joseph. And also the other question is, why do we say that the brothers sold him into slavery? Because it looks like, in fact, what happens is he's plucked out of the hole by Midianites / Ishmaelites. And the answer, I guess the answer is that the brothers say, we want to sell him into slavery, and he gets sold into slavery. So the tradition assumes one way or another they were part of this transaction. Although when Reuven returned to the pit and saw Joseph isn't in it, he rents his clothes and then returns to the brothers and says, the boy's gone, what am I supposed to do? So strictly speaking, the brothers don't really sell him into slavery. They just plan to, and then he gets taken by slave traders. And I don't know if this is true. This is totally made up, but I'm going to make this up anyway. My guess is that in the ancient world, when bands of people would travel and they would see any isolated person, they would snatch them up. And so people didn't travel alone because the slave trade was ubiquitous in the ancient world. Anyone who wasn't attached to someone was a potential, that was an economic resource. So you grabbed that person and you sold them. You didn't care that you were taking somebody's, brother or father or mother or sister or husband or wife or whatever. You just grabbed them. How they saw him in the pit, the only thing, again, totally making this up, because why not? We know that the Talmud says that it's an obligation for parents to teach their children to swim. And that's because there were a lot of pits and holes, and a lot of them had water, and so you could drown very easily in the ancient world. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a regular practice to look in pits for people, because I guess, it was not, if you don't have any paving facilities and you live in a land with cracks and crevices and hills and rocks, a lot of people can stumble and fall into pits at various times. And it sort of puts me in mind, I hope this isn't too trivial an analogy, of when we used to have payphones. And even if you didn't hear a coin drop, you would still check the little payphone thing just to see if your quarter came back, right? So you look in a pit, maybe there's someone in there. And they did, and they found him and they sold him. But it is certainly, literally speaking, at least according to the Torah, true that the brothers did not sell him into slavery. They planned to kill him. Judah persuaded them to sell him, and then he was taken by the tribes. But you have to ask yourself, would they have sold him anyway? And that I don't know. And they certainly then lied about it to their father, and had a guilty conscience, because they certainly assumed that he was taken and gone. So that is at least the beginning of the Joseph. There's more. We actually didn't talk that much about the Kohanim are descendants from Aaron. That's, someone asked if the Kohanim aren't descendants from Judah. Who are they descended from? They're the priests, so they're Aaron's family. Aaron, and so are the Levites, are from Aaron and Moses' family. Yeah. Go ahead.
37.
No, when Midianite trade, right. In verse 28, it says, when Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. But it is confusing because then in verse 36, it says the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him to Potiphar. So how did they sell him to the Ishmaelites? And then, unless there was a transaction back to Midianites, I mean, the point is, there's no way of figuring out who did this. So, it is deliberately confusing, even though the commentators try to unravel it and to make it make sense. And usually they insert an extra sale that isn't mentioned, or an extra two sales that aren't mentioned, or they identify Midianites and Ishmaelites as the same people, which doesn't seem like they are. So there really isn't a good way to unravel it that I've ever seen, although in Nechama Leibovitz's book, she has a whole section on how to try to unravel it. But nonetheless, we didn't at all really talk about Joseph and his dreams. The thing I want to say about Joseph and the dreaming and so on is, what is really interesting to me about the fact that Joseph is given these dreams is the Torah very rarely lets us in to people's internal psychological workings. We see a lot about what people do, but very rarely about what they think. Once we actually get to hear what God thinks when he says, when God says, am I going to hide from Abraham what I'm about to do to Sodom? We actually hear God's internal thought process, so to speak. But most of the time, we don't know what Abraham thought when he did the Akedah. We don't know what he thought when he argued for Sodom. We only know what he said and what he did. And the same thing is true most of the time with Moses and so on and so forth. But the dreams that Joseph has gives you an insight into his psychological workings and his sense of superiority that he had. And and how destructive that sense of superiority is. And this we know because from the beginning of the Torah, again and again and again, favoring one child over another, that is, giving them a sense that they're superior, is problematic, right? It starts with God favoring Abel over Cain, which leads to Cain's resentment. There's favoring of Isaac over Ishmael, of Jacob over Esau, of Joseph over the brothers, and it's just bad again and again and again and again. And that sense of I am special brings me back to some of you weren't here at the very beginning of the class, but I'm going to do it again because I think that it's worth it. That sense of I am special and therefore I can do anything is incredibly destructive in the world. And I turn you to this little clip this morning from the New York Times in a long article about Sam Bankman-Fried, who was special and is now under arrest. And he said, I would never read a book. I'm very skeptical of books. I don't want to say no book is ever worth reading, but I actually do believe something pretty close to that. Somebody who believes that like the accumulated wisdom of humanity has nothing to teach them is somebody who needs the accumulated wisdom of humanity. But he will, sadly, tragically in a way, because obviously very gifted, he will have lots of time to read, I suspect, in the near future. So, yeah, it's true. Somebody should send him a copy of the Torah. I will be happy to take it upon myself to do that. But it seems obnoxious and vindictive, so I wouldn't do it that way. But I once, without naming who, I actually once, many years ago, when I first graduated, I used to go up to Lompoc to study Jewish philosophy with somebody who was once a big financier and went to prison for a while. And I just thought it was so interesting to see that it was a big lesson in the basically fundamental humanness of everyone, because here was somebody who was enormously wealthy and enormously successful, and now they were in a prison suit and strip searched every time I came. And it really was very impactful at the time to see that. What's that? Was he a changed man? I would actually say, and I'm not at all, I have not seen, and I don't know of him since then. He's more or less disappeared off the radar. In his case, I'm not convinced. No. I think other people in similar cases did and could change, but this guy, I didn't get that sense, although I could be wrong, because it's so hard to see inside someone else's heart. Who knows? But anyway, it was, and the other thing that I learned was even when you say like this is a country club prison, it's a prison, you know, it's a prison. Granted, he was not in solitary confinement, but still, like the guards took every opportunity to let him know that he was nothing special to them. And it was not, I advise against it, is basically what I'm saying. Don't go. All right, any other questions or comments? Let's see. Sheep shearing, I know, is routine in the ancient world, and yet it seems to be associated in the Chumash with the initiating action of a big event. Is this worth interpreting? It probably is worth interpreting. I don't know how to interpret it. But there are sheep shearing festivals, because it happens, I guess, once a year. I don't know, not having any sheep shearing experience myself. But in the Torah, you're right. It's like a big event. It's a festival, and everybody gathers for that time. So I suppose the only way to really understand it is to ask somebody who's more familiar than I am with what that means. It's like the book from Africa to Zion by Danny Abede, who who grew up in Ethiopia and then came with the Ethiopian airlift to Israel. And he says that the world that he grew up in was basically the world of the Bible. There was no difference. It was the same world. And so someone like that would know, but I actually don't know if it's the same. Nice way to remember the trail of traders selling Yosef. Just think of Yamim, plural for days. Yishmaelites, Midianites, Yishmaelites, Midianites. I like that. I have never heard that before, and it's good, except that it doesn't cover all of it, because there's like internal selling too. But I'd have to look at the chart and see how that works. But it's saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. Let us sell them to the Ishmaelites. The Midianites pull him out of the pit. The Midianites then sell him to Potiphar, and then it says Potiphar bought them from the Ishmaelites. So it sort of works, but I'm not sure it works perfectly. But I'd have to, as I said, I'd have to diagram it and see if we can do better. The last comment that I'll make about the Joseph story, and then we can wrap it up for this week, is that when the brothers come to the father and say, which is which is in verse 33. When the brothers come to the father and they show him the cloak, and again, by the way, you have the same word, vayakira. It's the same, recognized. He recognized the cloak. He says, my son's tunic, a savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast. Okay? Now, why is he immediately run to that conclusion? I mean, yeah, it's plausible, but it's also plausible that Joseph was injured and is out there somewhere, or something else happened. So let me tell you at least one very interesting interpretation about why Jacob immediately assumes that Joseph must have been killed. Because if you go back to, just a moment, if you go back to chapter 31, verse 31. This is Jacob. Jacob has run away from Lavan. Lavan comes after him and says, you took my household idols. We know that Rachel took them, but Jacob doesn't know that, right? Jacob answered Laban, saying, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. But anyone with whom you find your God shall not remain alive. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have of yours and take it. Now, he says anybody who has the idols won't remain alive. What he doesn't know, and the verse points that out, it says Jacob, of course, didn't know that Rachel had stolen them. So Jacob carries a big burden of guilt because Rachel then dies. Remember, she dies young. And at least one modern commentator ties all of this together and says Jacob feels like he's cursed because he said this to Laban. And remember, Joseph is Rachel's child. So just as he feels like he's responsible for Rachel's death, he feels in some way guilty about Joseph, and that's why he favors him, because he was responsible for his mother's death, because he said this to Laban, not knowing that Rachel had taken the idols. Because without some kind of psychological explanation, it's really hard to understand why Jacob's reaction isn't, oh my God, let's all run out and see if we can find Joseph. He might be injured somewhere. He might be hurt with the bloody tunic. But instead, he immediately assumes that Joseph is dead and doesn't search for the body, does nothing, that he not only assumes he's dead, but that he was devoured by a beast. And he refused to be comforted, which again is not only because he was his favorite child, but also, by the way, is a big psychological burden to put on the other children. Because if he refuses to be comforted and he says, I'm going to go down to Sheol in grief, it's another way of saying, none of you are enough for me to be able to continue on. And in fact, this is a huge, obviously, dilemma that families who've tragically lost children do face if they have other children, which is how do you still make the other children feel like they're treasured and important and special when you have such grief for the child that you've lost. But it's an interesting reaction and worth noting and thinking about. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Yeah. Right. Typically, they leave a carcass. Right. Right. So the point was there would be some remains of Joseph that said he doesn't have a lot of experience with wild beasts devouring people, but usually they would leave something. We know this from National Geographic, right? And so there would be some remains of Joseph, but there isn't any remains of Joseph, and therefore it's at least questionable, although also presumably it's a vast area. I mean, where does he go to look? Because wherever they were doing, wherever the brothers were pasturing could have been far away. Yeah. So you said that the point was that if most of the people that you love and trust bring this back and say, but they don't say that he was devoured by a beast. They says they had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said, we found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not? So, however, if they found it, then they didn't see anything nearby, then presumably that at least lends credence to the idea that Joseph is killed, because if you find this bloody tunic and there's nothing around, then you assume he's carried off and, So I guess it's a plausible conjecture that he's dead, because if you found a bloody tunic in the middle of nowhere and you don't see anything around, then obviously he was either devoured, which is Jacob's conclusion, or he was carried off, which if you're carried off by animals, presumably that's the same thing. I don't know. It's a curious passage. I think like a lot of things in this story, it fits, but it doesn't fit perfectly. Just like the Midianites and the Ishmaelites. By the way, I should have mentioned the last conclusion, which will not surprise you, of modern scholars about the Ishmaelite Midianite thing, is that there are two sources that were combined together, and they were combined imperfectly. And there was a source that said that the Midianites, right, there was remember that the modern scholarship assumes the Bible is a combination of various sources. One source had a Midianite story, and the other had an Ishmaelite story. Yeah. Oh, and the other had an Ishmaelite story. And so when you combine them together, it didn't work perfectly. Maybe what? Oh, the cougar from Griffith Park, P22. There was an article in this morning, was it this morning's paper, that he's not doing well? The cougar, or yesterday's paper? Right, exactly. I forgot his name was P22. Yeah. Some equivalent of P22. That's the other thing that is so bizarre, is that like the ancient world lived with wild animals all the time. And when I say wild, I mean like, lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Like real wild animals, the kind that could kill you all the time. There were no zoos. There were no buildings like this. It was a totally different world, and a very dangerous one in lots and lots of ways. So there you have it. And that is the beginning of the Joseph story. More to come in the weeks ahead. And thank you for joining us this morning, those of you who are here in person and those of you who are here online, and have a good Shabbos.